So I couldn't understand much from the previous talk because I don't speak the language, but I guess you were convinced that autonomous cars is something important. So what I'm going to talk about is safety of autonomous cars. And the goal will be to formalize what does it mean to be safe for autonomous cars. So everybody is talking about safety. Should be safe, should be safe, should be safe, but what does it really mean? So the first try, when you hear about safety of autonomous driving, you hear a statistical claim. You hear that self-driving cars should be statistically better than the average human driver. Well, I don't think it's a good goal. I don't think it's enough. The reason, first, it's not transparent. So the society tolerates this argument of statistically better only when there is a big gap between the good and the bad. Okay, so if we had a huge difference between the safety of autonomous cars, the number of casualties from autonomous cars and human drivers, then maybe society will tolerate this argument. But if autonomous cars, at least in the beginning, will be better than human drivers, but not much more better than human drivers, say not more than 3 orders of magnitude better than human drivers, then since the type of mistakes will be different, society will not tolerate it. What will happen when an autonomous car will hit a little kid? Nobody will be calm about the argument that, well, statistically, we are better. Okay? In addition, the statistical argument is not practical. Because if you really want to claim this statistical argument, to really prove that you are better than a human driver, there is no way around it. You need to drive enough hours so as to show that the probability of hitting someone by an autonomous car is less than something than 10 to the minus 6. This is a probability per hour. This is a lot. Okay? Now, maybe you can do it once. But mathematically, you must do it after every update of the software. If you just change one line of code, there is a chance that you don't understand how come, but there is some butterfly effect, and this will cause to some bad event. Okay? In order to prove that this will not happen, you need to validate again. This is of course not practical. You cannot, after every update of the software, validate so many hours. Okay, so this is why the statistical argument is not very good. So let's think about another argument. The other argument is avoid accidents at all costs. If we want self-driving cars on the road, they should not do any accidents. This sounds great. Unfortunately, this will make autonomous cars useless. Because consider, for example, a typical highway situation. You have here 3 lanes. The self-driving car is a yellow car in the middle, here. Now, suppose that one of the surrounding cars, which may be driven by a human driver, will swerve into the yellow car, into the autonomous car. In this situation, there is nothing the yellow car can do in order to avoid an accident. An accident will happen. So the only way to avoid an accident of this type is not to be in this situation to begin with. But avoiding this situation meaning that you cannot drive on the highway. It's not practical, it's not useful. Okay? So it's not a good goal. And the big question here is a trade-off between usefulness and safety. We can be very, very safe by staying in the garage. Okay? We can be very, very useful, but by ignoring safety altogether. The delicate balance is a key question in self-driving cars. This is a report from the car industry newspaper. I removed the company that it talks about, okay? But it tells that self-driving cars are far from perfect, And the trick, it appears, is striking that balance between being a perfect driver and being a driver that blends in. And these cars that the article talks about struggle to handle certain driving tasks and irking fellow drivers on the road. On the other hand, other companies, and they are talking about Mobileye, have different solution. Mobileye relies on something it calls responsibility, sensitive safety, and this is what we talk about. I'm going to tell you what is the rationale behind our model of responsibility, sensitive safety. So again, the key question is balancing the usefulness and safety trade-off. And this trade-off happens also for human drivers. When you are in a hurry, you are late for work, you make a delicate balance, okay? And maybe you drive faster, maybe you take more risks, okay? Because you want to arrive faster to work, okay? But you should be responsible and you should be careful enough not to be reckless, okay? On the other hand, you want to arrive fast. So every driver, human driver, balances this trade-off. So let's look at the law. What does the law have to say about this balance? So we can look at tort law, and the term is a duty of care. It's a general term, not necessarily for autonomous cars, but it applies to autonomous cars as well. And the duty of care is a legal obligation which is imposed on an individual, requiring adherence to a standard of reasonable care, while performing any acts that could foreseeably harm others. And I took the quotation from Wikipedia. Okay? So the question is, how can we interpret this law? How can we interpret the duty of care law? Now, I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not talking about interpretation of the law for human drivers. I seek for an interpretation of the law that will be applicable to machines. So RSS, or responsibility safety, sensitive safety, our model is simply a rigorous mathematical model that formalizes some attempt to interpret the law of the duty of care, which is applicable to self-driving cars. This is what we are trying to do. So before describing this interpretation, we first need to ask ourselves, what are the properties of a good interpretation of this law? And there are three factors that are important here. The first one is soundness. It means that you cannot come with some interpretation that nobody will accept. Okay? The interpretation should comply with the common sense of how humans interpret the law. In addition, a good interpretation should lead to zero accidents in an utopic world where everybody follows the interpretation of the law. So if we agree about the interpretation and we all follow it, we expect that there will be no accidents because everybody is careful enough. Okay? So this is one goal that we want from our model. The second goal is usefulness. Okay? You can interpret the law and put a lot of responsibility on this interpretation, on the driver, and the end result of this interpretation is that you must stay in the garage. So fine, it is sound, but it is not very useful. Okay? So we want to be able to have millions of autonomous cars on the road while not blocking traffic and while not irritating all the human drivers. So it's fine if you have one autonomous car in a city. Well, if it blocks traffic from time to time, maybe it is acceptable. But once you will have many autonomous cars on the road, you cannot block traffic because you will block the traffic in the city. Finally, the third property of a good interpretation is that it will be applicable to machines. It means that we should have an algorithm that can verify that indeed we follow the interpretation of the law in an efficient manner. So We want to follow the interpretation of the law all the time because we don't want to be reckless. If we define what does it mean to be cautious and what does it mean to be reckless, we don't want to be reckless. Okay? And it's not trivial to come up with an interpretation of the law that machines can follow all the time, because there might be butterfly effects. So maybe the machine is doing currently something that looks innocent, but it will lead to a chain of events that in the end will lead to being reckless. Okay, so we don't want it. These are the properties that we want. Okay? And our proposal, this model of responsibility-sensitive safety, is indeed a mathematical model that formalizes a common sense interpretation of the duty of care law. It formalizes common sense notions like, what does it mean to be at a dangerous situation? What should be the proper response when you are in a dangerous situation? What does it mean to be cautious? What you can assume on how other road user will do while driving. All of these are intuitively, and in our minds as human drivers, we formalize these things, but in an intuitive manner. We want a mathematical, clear model that will formalize them. Now, RSS is designed for autonomous driving, and by design, it is provably efficiently verifiable. So we have a mathematical proof that if you follow some rules, you are guaranteed to always follow this interpretation of the law. But it may also be useful for human drivers or for ADAS applications. Maybe we want an ADAS feature that force human drivers to follow the same interpretation, and then we can prove that there will be no accidents. This may be also very interesting. And since it is just a proposal, okay, so we publish it, it's completely transparent. We published a white paper describing this model, and we want people in the industry to comment about this approach, to challenge us with questions, and to go together to the regulators in order to formalize something which is very important for this industry to grow. Okay, so now, hopefully, I convinced you that this is something that you should be interested about. And I will try to give you some highlights about how we do this. So what we did is we formalized just 5 rules, 5 common sense rules. These are really mathematical formulas that come to explain something that must be common sense by all of you. Something like, do not hit someone from behind, or do not cut in recklessly. Rules of priority and right of way, the fact that right of way is given but not taken. Rules about limited visibility, how you should respond to areas that you don't see, to occluded areas. And of course, rules of what you must do in order to prevent an accident. So if you can avoid an accident without causing another one, of course you must do it. So we formalize these rules in a way that will allow efficiently provable guarantees about following these rules. Let's take the first rule, and I will try to explain why it is not trivial to come up with such a model. So let's take the rule of do not hit someone from behind. Seemingly, this is a very simple rule, okay? Just do not hit someone from behind, okay? But once you try to formalize this, you see that it's not that trivial, because if you are the yellow car and you are driving just in one-way street, and suddenly the car in front of you start to go backward, okay? So you cannot avoid it, because if you will go backward, this car will hit you. So you cannot go backward. So this car can go backward and you will hit it from behind. Doesn't seem that this is something wrong with doing this, right? Okay, so we need to formalize it. Okay, suppose we do it. The next question is, what is reasonable to assume on the front car? So what might happen? You are driving behind a car, suddenly it brakes. Okay, you should be careful, okay? You should keep a safe distance in order that even if the car in front of you will brake, you will be able to brake as well and do not hit it. But how strong will it brake? Okay, so we can assume that it can brake in 10G. Okay, but this is a very strong assumption. And the result of this assumption will be not useful driving because you will need to keep a very large distance. So what exactly is the right balance between usefulness and safety? We must put a number of what is reasonable to assume and what is not reasonable to assume. Same thing about occluded areas. Suppose that you are following a car, okay, and this guy in the red car is approaching a car which is stand still or even drive to the opposite direction. Use a yellow car, you cannot see it because it's a smaller car, okay, or a pedestrian or something that you cannot see. And at the very, very last minute, the red car will swerve, avoid an accident. Now use a yellow car, may not be able to swerve as well, because maybe there is a bus beside you, okay? And you will end up hitting this car from behind. We just said that it is not allowed to hit someone from behind. Okay, so in order to avoid this, you need to make some assumptions on what is hidden behind the red car. Now you can say, okay, I make the worst case assumptions. There may be a car here which is driving very, very fast toward the red car. But the meaning of this assumption will be that you will not be able to drive at all. Because if the velocity of this blue car toward you is so large, then you must brake now. Okay, so we must make assumptions. This is the point. And we want to formalize a duty of care. You need to be careful, but how much? So we propose a framework that puts parameter on what you can allow, what assumptions you can allow to make, and what assumptions you are not allowed to make. Okay? Finally, even if you define everything properly and nicely and soundly, you need to come up with a way to guarantee that you will always obey to your own interpretation of the law. So this is a final thing that we need to ensure here. Okay, so now that hopefully I convinced you that it's not that trivial, okay, let's talk about the high-level techniques of how we do it. So again, it's common sense. We define safe distance. Safe distance will be the distance required to avoid a collision under reasonable assumptions. And of course, we need to formalize what are these reasonable assumptions. Then we say that a time is dangerous if the distance is non-safe. So if the distance is safe, nothing is dangerous. Once the distance is not safe, the time is dangerous. And whenever the time is dangerous, you should respond to the danger. And we call it a proper response. And the proper response here is very simple. If the time is dangerous, you need to brake. Okay? Now we need to formalize all of these. So there are parameters. These parameters determine what are the reasonable assumptions that you are allowed to make. So there is a parameter of response time. It will take you some time to figure out that the car in front of you is braking. Maximal acceleration. During this response time, you might even accelerate towards the car. But by how much? And then there is a maximal brake of the car in front of you. By how much will it brake? And then you will respond by braking as well, but by how much? So there is a parameter of sufficient brake from your side. And all of this, under these assumptions, you calculate the worst case situation. So we are talking about worst case. Okay? We need to cover all grounds, but under reasonable assumptions. So you need to put the limits of what are the reasonable assumptions, and then calculate the worst case. And here is a formula that calculates the worst case under these assumptions. Okay, so once you did it, The proper response is simple. If you are at an unsafe distance, you have response time, in which you can even accelerate, but after the response time, you must brake by a sufficient brake. Okay, this is a proper response. Here in this case, it's very simple. Okay? Now, the problem is that you may be at an unsafe distance from this car here, because it is occluded. You don't know that you are at a safe distance, so you will not respond properly according to the rule here, simply because you don't know that you violate the rule. So what you need to do is to assume the worst case, but again, unless the existence of a car in a certain kinematic state is unreasonable. And we formally define what does it mean to be in unreasonable state. Okay? So once you have the framework, and the framework is comply with common sense of what humans are doing in this situation, then you can calculate the worst case and behave accordingly. Okay. So now that we roughly understand the rules, how to efficiently verify that you are following them. And it's not trivial because of the butterfly effect that I talked about before. So the way we do it is we use a mathematical induction, a very basic mathematical idea from elementary school or high school, I don't know, depends. But we use it maybe in not so trivial way in order to prove that if a car complies with proper response rules that we formally define, so it's very easy to comply with proper response rules momentarily, and the other cars adhere to the reasonable assumptions that we define, then there will be no accidents. This is what we prove. And the idea of the proof is as follows. First, assume that there are no occlusions. This is the easy case. So if there are no occlusions, then you do the induction. The base of the induction, you start at an non-dangerous time. You can always start at an under dangerous time because you are standstill. Nothing can be dangerous when you are standstill. Okay. So now to the inductive step. If the next type is still non-dangerous, we are done. The induction goes on. Otherwise, we look backward in time to the first moment in which the situation became dangerous. And then, based on the definitions of proper response, we can be sure that if we apply proper response, we will be able to brake until either we will be at zero velocity, and again, at a non-dangerous situation, or the situation will become non-dangerous again because the car in front of us will accelerate. And this concludes the inductive argument. So this was the easy part. The more complicated part is what about occlusions? And what we do is we prove by a technique called double induction over the reals. So we apply inductions over the real numbers twice to show that if all the agents adhere to the reasonable assumption, then there will be no occluded car on which we do not apply proper behavior, proper response. And intuitively, in the example before, in this example, if we are doing something very bad, it means that the red car did something very bad as well. Okay? Because it didn't comply with proper response by swerving at the last minute. Now, needless to say, of course, if you can swerve as well and avoid an accident, of course you must do it. Nobody is saying that you just need to do the proper response and that's it. And actually this is a rule. If you can avoid an accident, you must do it. But what will happen if you can swerve, but by swerving, you will hit a pedestrian here? Now there are 5 people here and just 1 person here. The classical trolley problem. So I'm not giving an answer, but I'm just saying that RSS gives a framework for tackling the trolley problem. And you can say, okay, this is a society answer for this problem, and this is what we implement in the autonomous cars. Okay? Or car makers or technology makers decide what they are doing, and they publicly say in advance what they are doing. Okay. So this was a very simple case when we follow another car. What about cutting? What about situations when there is both lateral velocity and longitudinal velocity? In this case, intuitively, the car that performed a stronger lateral movement is responsible for a cutting. But it's not completely trivial to define exactly what does it mean, larger lateral movement. So I will go a little bit faster because of the time, but we propose a formal definition for who is doing a larger lateral movement. Okay. So once we have lateral and longitudinal safe distance, proper response becomes easy. If the longitudinal distance was last to become unsafe, then you should brake longitudinally, and otherwise you should brake laterally. All right. Now this is for, say, typical highway situations. When we come to junctions, we need to add another factor to the equation, and this is priority. So again, it's all about what are reasonable assumptions to make. So for example, here, the yellow car has priority. It can assume it can drive normally, and all of you are doing this, if the red car can brake before entering. Because you assume that it will respect priority rules. But if you have strong evidence that the red car is not going to respect priority rules, then right-of-way is given, not taken. So you can assume that the other players will behave unless you have a strong evidence that they are not behaving. And this is formalized in the paper and tackles all sorts of junctions. So we talked about few scenarios, but we think that RSS covers all scenarios. And the evidence for this, first we explicitly explain how RSS covers traffic lights, pedestrians, all type of merges, all type of junctions, unstructured roads. All of that is in the paper. In addition, there is an Occam-Razor argument. If you can explain all these scenarios by 5 rules, it's a good evidence that you are doing something right. Okay? In addition, we went to the NHTSA's typology of car accidents, which covers, I think, several millions of car accidents, and all of them are covered by RSS. We also encourage a discussion with OEMs, with our partners, BMW, for example, and we encourage partners to challenge us with uncovered scenarios, and of course, this should be a group challenge for the industry. It's not something specific for Mobileye. It can benefit everyone. So finally, the last question is about usefulness of the model. So maybe this model is sound, you can verify it efficiently, but can you drive normally while adhering to the rules in this model? So I will show you a video of Mobileye's car driving in streets of Jerusalem. And drivers in Jerusalem are not the nicest drivers in the world. Okay? So you will see our autonomous car perform. Can we start? Okay. This is an example of a lane change. So you see a top view, and you see that traffic is very dense, and we need to push in order to fit into traffic, and people are not very nice and do not let us go easily, but we do it assertively, but safely. Okay? Or a lane change, again, in a highway, we want to go to the right because we need to take a highway exit. Now what we do is we will now accelerate in order to make a gap, and once it is safe enough, then we can fit into the gap. Another example is we are again taking a lane change, and there is a motorcycle here which does not let us, so we let him go and then go. And this balance between safety and usefulness, we solve it because we have a model. Because we have a strong model that tells us exactly the boundaries of what is safe, we can be assertive and we can push the limits until the model. Okay? So this is how we manage to have normal flow in very, very dense traffic while making sure that we are not doing something very stupid. Okay? Last slide, please. Thank you. Okay, so to sum up, what is RSS? We start from the law, duty of care law. This law should have an interpretation which will fit autonomous cars, because fuzzy meaning of the law will not help us. We need clear definition, clear mathematical definitions of what does the law has to say, what does it mean to be careful enough. A good interpretation should have three properties. The first one is soundness. It should be common sense. It should lead to utopia. If everybody follows the law, we want no accidents. It should be useful, allows agility in the decision making, allows a normal flow of traffic in densely populated areas. And it should be efficiently verifiable so that we can make sure that every car that goes on the road indeed follows this law. RSS is a proposal for this interpretation of the law, and I encourage you to comment on this model, to join us in going together as an industry to regulators and to the society and tell them this is what we see as safety of autonomous cars. Thank you very much.